In 2025, President Trump launched an all-out trade war, cornering Canada with crippling tariffs on everything from cars to steel. He expected a swift surrender. Instead, he got a stunning checkmate. While Canada quietly weaponized its energy grid, another global power, China, began squeezing America's supply of critical rare earth minerals. Caught in a two-front economic war, the White House strategy began to crumble, leaving the American economy to pay the price. How did a tariff gambit designed to crush an ally get crushed by a silent energy alliance and a global resource squeeze? For decades, the US-Canada relationship was powered by more than just goodwill. It was powered by an energy grid so deeply integrated, it functioned as a single continental life support system. With two-way energy trade worth over $150 billion, the US became profoundly dependent on its northern neighbor, importing nearly $124 billion Canadian energy in 2024 alone. This seamless flow of oil, gas, and electricity was the bedrock of North American industrial might and a cornerstone of American energy security. But under the America First doctrine, this deep integration was no longer seen as a partnership. It was reframed as a vulnerability. The Trump administration viewed America's reliance on Canadian energy not as a strategic asset, but as a point of leverage to be exploited. The era of predictable cooperation began to erode, replaced by a new philosophy of economic coercion. In March 2025, the White House launched its first major salvo, hitting the deeply integrated auto sector with a 25% tariff. It was a clear signal that no industry was safe and that the historic energy alliance would not stop the administration from using brute force to achieve its political goals. The unspoken pact of mutual reliance was broken, setting the stage for a conflict where Canada would be forced to weaponize the very system that once bound the two nations together. In the spring and summer of 2025, President Trump escalated his trade war on Canada from a series of disputes into a full-blown economic siege. Believing he held all the cards, he deployed his primary weapon, overwhelming tariff pressure. The initial 25% tariff on autos was just the beginning. The administration then slammed Canadian steel and aluminum with duties soaring as high as 50%. And by July, it raised the tariff ceiling on a wide range of Canadian goods to a crippling 35%. The strategy was one of brute force, designed to inflict maximum economic pain and force Ottawa into submission. The White House calculated that Canada's heavy reliance on the US market was its Achilles heel, and that under enough pressure, its government would have no choice but to fold and accept a deal on American terms. It was a classic Trump maneuver: create a crisis, apply overwhelming force, and dictate the terms of the surrender. The administration justified this economic assault as a necessary rebalancing of an unfair relationship. They argued that these tariffs were a tool to force Canada to the negotiating table on a host of issues. Publicly, the rhetoric was defiant, framing the trade war as a fight for the American worker against allies who had taken advantage of the system for decades. Every move was calculated to project an image of strength and control, a demonstration that the United States could and would use its economic might to get what it wanted. Trump had cornered his ally, creating a high-stakes standoff where he believed there was only one possible outcome: a Canadian capitulation. He had started a fire, confident that his neighbor had no way to put it out. But Trump had fundamentally misread the situation. He saw dependence, but Canada's new government, under Prime Minister Mark Carney, saw leverage. Instead of engaging in a self-defeating tariff-for-tariff battle, Canada unleashed a sophisticated, three-pronged energy strategy designed to counter American pressure. The first prong was a surgical strike. In response to the auto tariffs, the province of Ontario threatened a 25% surcharge on the 35.7 terawatt hours of electricity it exports to border states like New York, Michigan, and Minnesota. This wasn't a broad attack. It was a targeted threat to drive up energy costs in key US industrial regions, a direct warning that Canada could turn the dial on the very power that keeps American factories running. The second prong was a strategic pivot. In the summer of 2025, the LNG Canada facility in Kitimat, British Columbia, shipped its very first cargo of liquefied natural gas, not to the US, but to Asia. This was a landmark moment, opening a Pacific gateway that physically diversified Canada's energy exports away from the American market. The third prong was a global alliance. Canada moved swiftly to solidify energy and industrial partnerships with the European Union and Japan, signing new agreements in June 2025 that focused on clean energy, critical minerals, and defense. This created new, stable markets for Canadian resources, making the country progressively less vulnerable to American coercion. As Canada was executing its energy pivot, the other side of the vice began to close on the United States. In April, and again with more force in August, China tightened its control over the global supply of rare earth elements. Citing its own national interests, Beijing restricted the export of the technology used to produce powerful permanent magnets, the kind essential for everything from American electric vehicles and wind turbines to F-35 fighter jets and drone engines. According to the US Geological Survey and the International Energy Agency, China doesn't just dominate the mining of these materials, it holds a near monopoly on the complex processing and magnet manufacturing stages, controlling roughly 86% of the critical supply chain. Trump's tariffs were aimed at his friends, but a global superpower had just targeted his nation's most critical vulnerability. President Trump was stunned. He found himself caught in a perfect storm, a two-front economic war he never saw coming. His tariff sledgehammer, designed to crush a single ally, was now useless. As he tried to punish Canada, Canada was busy building new energy alliances that made his threats increasingly irrelevant. At the exact same moment, China's rare earth squeeze was threatening to cripple America's most vital high-tech and defense industries. The White House strategy had backfired spectacularly. The attempt to prove American strength had only exposed its deep dependence on both a resilient Canadian energy system and a hostile Chinese supply chain. The bully had been boxed in, leaving the American economy to pay the price for his miscalculation. While Canada's long-term energy strategy provided powerful leverage, it could not insulate its most integrated industries from the immediate shock of Trump's tariffs. The Canadian auto sector, the backbone of Ontario's economy, was thrust into chaos. For decades, the industry has operated as a single continental system, with parts and vehicles crossing the border seamlessly multiple times during production. The 25% tariff was a grenade thrown into this finely tuned machine. It created massive logistical hurdles and imposed devastating new costs on Canadian parts manufacturers and assembly plants, threatening the jobs of over 100,000 workers whose livelihoods depend on this cross-border integration. For a family in southern Ontario, the abstract trade war in the headlines became a very real fear of layoffs and economic hardship, a direct consequence of being targeted by their closest partner. The pain was equally intense in Canada's steel and aluminum industries. These sectors, long the pride of industrial towns, were suddenly fighting for survival. The punitive tariffs made Canadian metal uncompetitive in the US market overnight, forcing plants to consider scaling back production or shutting down entirely. The Canadian government was forced to respond with countermeasures and domestic aid, but the damage was done. The trust that had underpinned billions of dollars in cross-border trade was broken, leaving these cornerstone industries facing a deeply uncertain future and forcing Canada to accelerate its costly, long-term pivot away from the American market. The price of sovereignty was being paid by the workers on the factory floor. On the American side of the border, the cost of this trade war was immediate and multifaceted. When Ontario threatened a 25% surcharge on its electricity exports, it sent a chill through the energy markets of the Great Lakes region. These states rely on Canadian hydropower as a critical source of clean, reliable energy, especially during peak demand in the heat of summer or the cold of winter. The threat of losing that supply or paying a punitive price for it meant the risk of higher utility bills for millions of American households and businesses. It was a stark reminder that the US energy grid doesn't stop at the border, and a hostile relationship with Canada directly threatens the stability and affordability of power for Americans. But the most severe cost was the strategic one exposed by China's rare earth squeeze. The trade war with Canada had distracted the White House, leaving it blind to a far greater economic threat. With Beijing restricting access to the processed minerals and magnets essential for US defense and technology, the country was suddenly facing a national security crisis. The tariffs intended to bring jobs back to America were now being overshadowed by a supply chain vulnerability that could halt production of everything from electric cars to guided missiles. In a state of panic, the White House was forced to propose a billion-dollar emergency fund to try and build a domestic supply chain from scratch, a process that experts say will take years, if not decades. The price of punishing an ally was a stunning exposure of America's deepest economic weakness. A president's tariff gambit, designed to prove American dominance, has been crushed between a Canadian energy pivot and a Chinese resource squeeze. The attempt to corner an ally has backfired, leaving the United States facing higher costs, a fractured partnership, and a glaring exposure of its most critical supply chain vulnerabilities. The old rules of North American trade are broken, and the path forward is dangerously uncertain. In the race to define the future, will North America win together, or will both nations lose by trying to go it alone? Are you American or Canadian? Share your story and your perspective in the comments below.